Welcome to everyone joining us at our budget meeting tonight. I'd like to call the meeting to order, and we will do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the
United
States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Nice job. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone and our new our budget committee members. I would like to take a motion to enter into an open meeting of our budget committee. I'll take a motion. Mrs. Nardolillo, a second. Mr. Johnson, all in favor? All right, thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our budget co-chairs, and that happens to be Mrs. Nardolillo and also Mr. Vondell. And actually, I'm going to hand it over to Mrs. Nardolillo and Mr. Vondell right now. So go to it.
Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. First of all, Ron and I would like to extend our gratitude to our board clerk and secretary to the superintendent, Ms. Jane Dawson, for her attention to detail and tireless efforts that allows us to be together tonight. So, Jane, we thank you very much for all your hard work.
Yes, thank you, Jane. Great job.
We welcome everyone tonight to our budget and what we consider the official kickoff to our budget season, even though work on this budget has started even before the last budget passed. So we welcome the returning budget representatives and our new budget representatives. In a moment, we'll have you introduce yourselves. But before that happens, I just want to give you an idea of how the format that we're using tonight. First of all, anyone, anyone online can submit questions throughout the evening to communications@ncolony.org. And that will come up on our screen once the presentation begins, in case you didn't get a chance to jot that down. So at any time throughout the night, feel free to submit questions, comments, concerns. We really appreciate your participation in tonight's meeting and all of our budget meetings. So I guess the next thing would be to introduce or ask you, I'll ask our budget representatives to introduce themselves. And I'll start with our students, if that is okay. Beginning with 12th grade. I believe Eva is our 12th grade representative. Is Eva here tonight to say hello to us?
Each of the student representatives are going to come a different day.
Okay, so are you obviously you were the winner for tonight. And can you introduce yourself to us?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name's Catherine Konjalka. I'm the sophomore member of Student Board of Finance, and all four of us are student representatives for the budget committee this year.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and we appreciate you being with us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Catherine. So we'll go on now to the representatives for Shaker High School. We have Jill and Mary. I know I saw Mary. I'm not sure if Jill is here but if you are, please introduce yourself.
I'm Mary Alber, and I have a son at the high school in 9th grade, and I have a daughter in 8th grade who will be at the high school next year. So representing for the high school parents.
Hope you're having a good year so far. And Ms. Jill, do you know, Mary, if Jill is here, or is it going to be a shared responsibility for the representation at the Shaker High School?
I think it's shared responsibility. I'm not sure if she's on the call. I can't tell.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on then to Shaker Junior High School. Is Lisa with us tonight?
Yes, hi. I'm Lisa Buffaline. I have two 13-year-olds in 8th grade, so they'll be moving on to the high school next year. And I'm the PTA president for the junior high. I think I will be forever.
Everybody that is the PTA president at the junior high feels that way.
And that's okay. That's okay.
It's all good, yes. And thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, and Blue Creek, is Carrie with us?
I believe Carrie is not here.
Okay, how about Hills, Heather and Tom?
Mr. Ross is here.
Well, good.
How's it going? Have a good night, everybody.
Tom, do you mind that I use your first name or?
Tom is perfect. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have asked.
No, it's perfect.
Oh, thank you. And how about, now are you sharing this responsibility with Mr. Pillai?
Yep, I'm here to, this is Sudhakar Pillai.
Okay.
I have a daughter in Borders, and I like to thank you guys all working so hard. The pandemic, is really unprecedented time, so I want to take the opportunity to thank, for all the hard work you guys do. It's amazing.
Thank you for that recognition.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. And we appreciate you being here tonight. And at Forts Ferry, we have Karen and Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Bevins. I have a son at Forts Ferry and a daughter in the middle school. And I think Karen's also on the call.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. I'm here. And yeah, I have a son at Forts Ferry and a daughter in 7th.
Nice to see you again, and we're happy to have you. And Latham Ridge is Joe Perry. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe Petrie. I apologize. Okay, we'll move on to Loudonville. Are Jen or Trish here?
I believe they're both here.
Oh, good. It's nice to see the face that goes with the name.
Here, I'll go ahead. Hi, I'm Trish Vecchione. I am a Loudonville teacher. I am also a Loudonville parent and also a member of Loudonville's PTA Executive Board.
Thank you so much for being here. And is Trish with you tonight?
Would be Jen Schultz.
Oh, I'm sorry. You are Trish. I apologize. Jen.
Jen, you're muted.
Jen, we still can't hear you.
Good to see you.
That's the way those things go sometimes.
That's right. And Jason from Southgate. Well, I hope we have an opportunity to get to know each of you as these meetings progress. And again, on behalf of the Board of Education, Ron and I, Mr. Rondell and I are very happy to have you here, and we really are grateful for your participation in these budget meetings. So with that, Mr. Core, I know you'd like to get out by 11.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Nardillo, for that warm welcome here. So could we bring up the presentation, Mr. Doss? So welcome, everybody. My name is Joe Core. I'm superintendent of the North Colony Central School District. Before we get started here, we follow the following process. So as we go through the presentation here, you may form questions. We open up questions to the Board of Education first, followed by the Budget Committee members, and then we check with our Communications Department to see if we have had questions submitted online. And in perfect timing here, we have as Mrs. Nardillo spoke to in the beginning, if you have questions or comments, you may submit them to communications@ncolony.org. So let's take a look at our first slide here. So in North Colony, we are focused on our mission. And, I think it's very interesting at this point in time that, we establish a little bit of perspective. We held our first budget meeting in early March 2nd, and then we followed with another one on March 9th. And then this was last year, of course, and then we were shut down, as every district was in the state, officially on the 13th of March. And so Ms. Skeels will be speaking later on, when we look at our mission and how this experience, or really put a framework here on, issues that we will be considering as we go through the budget process here. Our first night really is to frame the issue here, to provide an overview of the budget environment. And so in starting to provide that overview, it's important for us to take a look at our mission. Our mission is the lens through which we form our budget. And there are two components to this mission. A component that addresses our students. And the first component, that bullet you see up first and foremost, is all students are provided the opportunity and necessary support to engage in relevant, challenging work which contributes to their academic and social growth and development. And so the imperative word in that is all. And what we strive to do through our commitment to continuous improvement in the district is to work at getting better at all, and looking at who we might not be meeting the needs of as well as we could. And so that word is a word that we take very seriously, and it is a gauge by which we undertake this budgetary process. I think we also look at the components of academic growth and social growth and development. And we look at how this mission statement really contributes to the total educational development of each and every child. The second part of that addresses the issue of all staff, teachers, and administrators are part of a larger learning community, working together to build a collective capacity in order to provide a high quality, relevant, equitable education for all. More than ever, as a result of the pandemic, we have realized the importance of community, relationships, connections in the work we do as a school. And really, the essential work of a school is done by our teachers. Our teachers are the biggest single factor in impacting the academic achievement of our students. Our administrators and our support staff, all those individuals who transport our students to school, to feed them, to support the work of the district, our administrators who direct programs and create vision, all of the school internal community works together to provide a quality education for each and every child. And so we work constantly at building the collective capacity of each and every individual to give them what they need to provide this high quality education for all our students. So that is an essential part of our mission statement. Next slide, please. So when we look at our budgeting process, we have relied on our three major pillars that continue to guide our work. Pillar one is academic excellence. Essentially, how do we identify and address the continuity of learning? How do we make sense of that? How do we build upon what our students need to know and need to be able to do? How do we build skills throughout their K-12 experience here in North Colony? Equity. Equity is essential, and we keep looking at how we can achieve that all in our mission statement. How do we innovate? How do we promote excellence? How do we, with intentionality and conscientiously, examine our work and avoid creating or expanding opportunity gaps? And in this time, we know that social emotional health, ensuring student safety and well-being, is more at the forefront of our attention than ever. And so now I would like to turn it over to Ms. Skeels, who will go in depth with regard to our pillars and to put them to the context of the ongoing pandemic. Ms. Skeels.
Sure. So on the slide that Mr. Core was just talking about, those three pillars that you saw are pillars that we use every year: academic excellence, equity, and social and emotional learning. The sub-bullets there were bullets really that reflect the climate of the times. So the first pillar, which was academic excellence, the sub-bullet for that said, looking at continuity of learning. That is specific to really the year that we're in the pandemic. How will we, when hopefully we're back in September in our regular way, how will we assess the continuity of learning where all of our students are and where they're able to go? And Jane, if you want to go back a slide, I'm actually on that slide. Thanks. In equity, really, we have to look at students have been in all different places. Some have been in school, some have been out of school, some have done a little bit of both. So how do we continue to innovate so that we can promote excellence like we always have, but avoid any gaps that may have arisen during the pandemic? And quite frankly, our teachers have learned a lot over the last year, as we all have. They have been very innovative. They have many new skills, I would say. And how do we continue to use those to go forward? And then safety is always our number one mission, but we really have to think about student staff, their safety, first of all. Obviously, the pandemic, we're still going to need to do cleaning, we're still going to need to do disinfecting and have PPE, but also their emotional well-being. These have been traumatic times for people, and our students are coming in with all kinds of different experiences, as are the adults who work with them. So we have to prioritize that. Thanks, Jane. The next slide. So thinking specifically about academic excellence, so first of all, the one thing that we can't say enough is we've always had them as separate pillars: academic excellence, social, and emotional. But if there's one thing that we've always known but really has become clear in the pandemic, is social, emotional health and safety is a foundation for academic excellence. If you are not feeling safe, if you are not feeling emotionally healthy, it's really hard to engage with your academics. So we have to realize that those two are really deeply interwoven and really work together. All our teachers, it's not teachers on this side and counselors on that side, it's all of us working together to attend to the whole child. So what have we learned about our strengths and needs and our students' strengths and needs during this pandemic? As I mentioned before, teachers are doing things with technology that a year ago, many of them didn't know about. I certainly didn't know about. And they took on the challenge to do what was best for the kids. And our kids have also learned incredible skills during this time. So how do we harness those strengths and get even better? And then what needs have we really started to see during this pandemic, and how will we address them? And we have to ask some tough questions. What worked and did not work in remote learning, as well as in brick and mortar learning? Things have been different this year. And so we have to look with a critical eye to make sure we have a sense of new things that are working that we should continue to do, things that maybe we discovered that used to work, maybe don't work as well anymore. And that's part of being a learning organization. We are a great district, but we're not a perfect district. No district in America is, and our goal should be always to get better. And the only way we can get better is if we look at how well we're doing and where we can improve. We have to look at how we prioritize curriculum and instructional practices that will best serve our students. There's no doubt that this has been a different year. And so we have to really think deeply about how we move students forward without overwhelming them, but also keep them moving in the right direction as we all kind of return together with luck that things continue to go well with the virus, so that we can all come back together and move forward as a unit in September. And then how do we support our teachers? This year was a whole new reality, but we also have to realize next year is going to be a whole reality too, because we're going to be integrating back in perhaps students who've been learning remotely for a year with students who've been in person for a year. We're going to have some elementary students who haven't had much classroom experience at all. Maybe they've been remote. So we really have to think about that. Next year will feel different too. But if we got through this year, we can do anything. Next slide, Jane. So Mr. Corr mentioned equity, and in schools all over the nation, this is not just North Colony, the pandemic has intensified equity issues. We see that in the health outcomes for different demographic groups as we look as a nation, as a state, and also in our district. We see how the pandemic has disproportionately affected certain communities in terms of economic outcomes. So that's not just North Colony, that is everywhere, but it's something we really need to be aware of. The other piece that we have to be aware of is our students are going to come in with different experiences, and that may lead to elevated anxiety or trauma. We have students who have lost loved ones due to this pandemic. And we have some students whose lives have been impacted very minimally by this pandemic. And what I've been saying is every year when we start school, kids start all over the place. Of course they do. No two kids are alike. But I would say that the range of experiences has grown even greater through the pandemic. And so we need to know how to meet all of our kids and recognize that it might not just be the kid who's tuning out. It might not just be the kid who has a low grade. It could be the kid who has an 85 average, but is really still struggling with the impacts of this pandemic. And so we have to be very sensitive to that and be prepared to meet those needs. Because if we don't meet those needs, we can't just start piling on academics. It won't work. How do we ensure that all of our learners are equally advantaged upon return to school in September? We'll talk at a later meeting about summer programming and how do we use some of that summer programming. Again, like all schools in the nation, some of our kids are a little bit lost. Some of our kids are a little bit disengaged. This has been really hard for some students. And if we think they're just going to run back in September, jump on a bus and come back like nothing ever happened, I think we might be missing a moment here to use some time over the summer to work with students, work with families, so that when September comes around, it doesn't feel like such a big leap. And in order to do that, we really might need to prioritize our resources so we can serve our most vulnerable. And then always with equity, we will always ask, are there policies or practices that have inadvertently contributed to systemic inequities? That's a question you always ask when your mission statement is an equitable education for all. But as Mr. Corr mentioned earlier, the pandemic has shown us where some of those policies and practices really do impact different kids differently. And I think in order to take something good out of the pandemic, we have to take the wisdom that we've gotten over this last year, and in order to make more equitable outcomes for all students, which is always our goal as a district. Jane. Thank you, Jane. And the last one is the social emotional health. And again, we will say this again and again, social emotional wellness and academic learning are interconnected. And with the vast numbers of students who might have anxiety, they might have depression, they may just have feelings that they don't know how to handle, we have to realize that that's part of what it means to teach the whole child. So we have to collaborate. And by collaborate, that means we have incredible social workers, counselors, psychologists in this district, and we have incredible teachers. So how do we work together so that as a system, we can wrap our arms around our kids and really buffer any traumatic effects that this crisis might have had, particularly on our most vulnerable? Because we've all heard the phrase, it takes a village, and it does. Everyone is here, from the school board, the teachers, to the support staff, to help our students feel safe and help them return to something that feels like normal. And our work as a team, I don't think has ever been more important. So how will we design school? How do we make time for mental health beyond just a curriculum that New York State says we have? How will we create a supportive and inclusive environment that, as Mr. Kaur said, prioritizes connectedness? I think many of us through this pandemic have felt disconnected. A Zoom meeting is kind of, I wrote something about a Zoom meeting being a little bit like a funhouse mirror. It looks a lot like what we know, but it's not quite the same thing. And so we have worked very hard to reach out to kids and to families, but it's been different. So how do we bring back that spirit of connectedness and energy back into our schools so that we all feel like we are this one North Colony again? And to that end, I think we really have to think about how do we create experiences that are based in levity and joy and agency. If there's one thing that kids feel right now, it's a lack of control. Quite frankly, a lot of us feel this in the pandemic, right? And nobody likes the feeling of having no control. So how do we give them some sense of control over their world so that we can counterbalance the effects of the pandemic? I mean, we can say, come on, and chin up, kid, let's move forward, but that's not going to go very far. So the things that we do that are so positive in this district, how do we intentionally include those next year? Because of course there will be this push for academics and we've got to catch up. And certainly we do, but we can't catch up if we're not paying attention to social and emotional wellness first. And we can do both together, but we have to do both. So those three pillars that have always sort of been there in the background, I think set the stage for the year to come and how we will prioritize things in our budget for what we value in order to create the best educational experience we can for our students and their families and have this inclusive and positive vision for success.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Skills. I really appreciate that. Is an outstanding and excellent overview of the context in which we operate, in which we operationalize the pillars in the pandemic. And those are major considerations that will form the thinking during this budget season. So thank you very much. Ms. Dawson, could we look at the next slide, please, right now? So we are now going to delve into some of the nitty-gritty financial details that form the resource framework for this year's budget. So these are some of the major budget facts for the year 2020, and really they are facts that really form the background and the basis by which we construct budgets in this district. So by the data standards formed by the state, we are considered a low needs district by New York State. So we are high resource and low needs. So because of that, the vast majority of our revenue comes from property taxes. So that you can see that 3/4 of it, 75.2% to be exact, comes from property taxes, from the taxes placed upon the homes and the businesses of the approximately 38,000 residents who reside within North Colony. 17.5% of our revenue comes from state aid. If you took a long view of that, going back 30, 40 years, that has been a steady decline from a point where at one point 50% of the budget was funded by state aid. That is a decreasing amount. So what that means, therefore, is the burden is now shifted more to the taxpayer away from the state. 7.3%, which represents the balance of our revenue, comes from fund balance, comes from our reserves that are designated for certain purposes, and other miscellaneous revenues, some of them from tuition, some of them, of course, from the federal government. And this year, under the guise of state aid, quite honestly, the federal portion has increased substantially. When we started our budget season last year, prior to the pandemic, and without any knowledge or foreshadowing of what was to come, New York State at that time faced a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall, and that was as of March 1st, 2020. That shortfall was about $6 billion. It has subsequently grown to nearly $15 billion. And this is the structural and profound deficit that is faced by the state of New York that will only impact local governments and, considering school districts as another local government, school districts in New York State. What we know for certain is that the significant federal funding that we received in 2021 and what we anticipate receiving in an even greater amount in 2021 and 2022 has made up the state shortfall and has cushioned us to the reality of the profound issues that the state faces now. And I think that is a constant financial theme for this year's budget. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So when we take a look at the 2021-22 executive budget, this is the governor's budget, which was released back in January. This is a big picture and a big overview here. And certainly I would like our Assistant Superintendent for Business, Mr. Hoot, to interject at any time to add depth, detail, elaboration, and if need be, correction to anything that I may misstate. And I hopefully will not do that, but I certainly do not want any misinformation out there. So this year, what looks like let's look at the 7.1% increase in total funding in New York State. And that is an amount of $2.11 billion, and that is the increase in total funding to education. So in actuality, that is a $607 million reduction in state funding and a $2.72 billion increase in federal support. So I think that's how we arrive to a 7.1% increase or a $2.11 billion increase in actual dollars in total funding for education. That is due to a $2.72 billion increase in federal support. Now that is wonderful and it's much appreciated, but it is, as far as we know at this point in time, one time. So that includes, that state funding includes the STAR adjustment. So STAR is the state's program to provide tax relief, school tax relief to property owners. And so what the state looked at was they looked at a $1.35 billion local district funding adjustment. And they looked at that. They would take that against the STAR program and not against school aid. Now that 1.35 billion is really, it represents a reduction, and then through their various calculations, they would backfill and increase that through federal support monies. So in the case of North Colony, they took that against STAR and not against school aid. And it was the greater of the two numbers that would be allowed. And in our case, our school aid increase is greater. So the foundation aid, okay, this is the basic aids given to all schools in the state of New York. That is frozen at zero for the second year. And there were 11 aids that used to be called expense-based aid. So the formulas that were used to derive the monies that would flow to school districts were based upon expenditures during the prior year. Transportation aid is an excellent example of that. BOCES aid, if you buy services through the local BOCES, that is aidable, and it's based on your aid ratio and the amount that you spend. So these 11 aids are now all lumped together into a general category called services aid. And in addition, the money that was earmarked for this has been cut by $693 million against current law. So there are two negatives associated with this. Number one, the cut. And number two, the predictability of services aid. That was the one aid by virtue of the fact that it was based upon how much you spent the prior year that you could count on, that you could calculate accurately. And now we don't have a sense of how that is going to turn out at all. We'll talk more about partial assistance with the transportation aid issue, but this goes back to after schools were closed last March, there was a threat to take away all transportation aid from March on, and that was based on the faulty assumption that schools did not use transportation during that time, when in fact they did. And we'll talk about that in greater depth in a future slide here. And so this state budget now assumes $6 billion in federal assistance that was passed by the Federal Coronavirus Relief Act of December. $15 billion was requested. We do not know. We know, as you probably know from following the news on the federal level, there is an additional coronavirus relief bill currently. It has passed the House of Representatives and is now in the Senate. We do not know, or we don't really have a clear forecast on how this will impact school funding. Much of the December stimulus was used to support schools in the state. So let's go to the next slide here. So we'll refer to this a lot because if enacted in the budget, the shift of the expense-based, the 11 major expense-based aids into services aid would be a great departure, and quite frankly, for school districts, an unwelcome departure from previous practice. So the services aid would be the aid for transportation. So essentially what you spent on transportation came back at a ratio the next year. BOCES aid, special services aid, charter school transitional aid, high tax aid, supplemental public cost aid, academic enhancement aid, and instructional materials aids for libraries, textbooks, software, and computer hardware all represent the expense-based aids. Again, now they have all been combined into this generic category entitled services aid. So going forward, these aids would not be expenditure driven, and increased spending would not generate additional aid. So this is unfortunate. For example, BOCES aid, the incentive for participating in BOCES was to leverage the capacity of multiple school districts, in our case, 24 school districts within our region, to combine services, to collaborate on purchasing and achieve better pricing and the like. And that was further incentivized by the fact that by participating in that, in our case, we received aid for 50% of the cost approximately the next year. Now, again, as I've stated, they have been collapsed into this generic services aid, and we lose the advantage of the increased aid we would get because it's been cut, and also the predictability that we have by gauging our purchases and factoring in the aid ratio on that. So let's look to the next slide, please. So Another key and important factor to note is that our foundation aid remains flat for the second consecutive year. We are used in the state for foundation aid to represent modest increases. Last year, it was a departure from that usual practice for it to not be increased, and so it remains flat for this second consecutive year. Did mention transportation aid last spring, and so schools delivered meals, we delivered instructional materials, and we delivered devices, and also boosters really to provide internet access for our students. So these expenses now will be allowed, and this is fortunate, that they will be allowed under transportation aid in this budget. The next part is difficult to explain because it's not represented clearly, but the school tax relief program, or STAR program, the exemption for new recipients has been eliminated. So what would happen now is that once a citizen who is 65 or older becomes eligible for the enhanced STAR credit, and once that citizen meets the certain income levels that is required, that individual would receive the STAR credit. Now, prior to that, it was a STAR exemption. What was the difference? The state defines the exemption as this is essentially the tax bill is adjusted automatically. So the tax bill that the homeowner would receive in qualifying for enhanced STAR would have been reduced by the exemption. Now, this system is changed where the property owner would register, and then the property owner would receive a STAR credit, which in essence is they would pay their tax bill in full and then would receive a check later on. So that is the proposal in this executive budget. Let's look at the next slide, please. So this is going to be a side-by-side comparison here. This is per the executive budget, and it represents New York State's executive budget, the one proposed by the governor. And for that, I will now turn it over for the item-by-item analysis to Mr. Scott Hoot, our Assistant Superintendent for Business. Mr. Hoot.
Thank you, Mr. Corr. As Mr. Corr indicated, this chart is representative of the executive budget for school aid for 21-22. The top line, the largest number on the chart, is foundation aid, and as has been indicated, is flat once again. Therefore, you see zero change in the right-hand column. The services aid, the second line, is the consolidation of the 11 expense-based aids. This represents a slight increase for us, but as Mr. Corr indicated, all school districts received some kind of reduction in the executive budget, as opposed to allowing the formulas to run at 100%.
So if I can just interject here, Mr. Hoot, too. So if you, again, just to make that clear, Mr. Hoot stated it very clearly. Okay, the services aid, you look and you said, what's he talking about? We're up by $329,000, but that still represents being shorted $581,000 that we would have been given had, or about $580,000 we would have been given had the expense-based aids been allowed to run as they normally would. Go ahead, Mr. Sorry.
Yes, I would just add one thing, that in terms of the executive budget proposals in prior years, proposals such as this and consolidating various expense-driven aids is not new. We have seen those in various forms over the past few years. So it is It is once again in the executive budget, and we'll have to see how things work out. It would be detrimental to districts if they were consolidated and not allowed to flow based on the expenses that districts actually incurred. The third line is building aid, and building aid is representative of the formulas that each project that is applicable to each building project. The district has some old projects from a number of years ago, and also has a number of what I will call cash projects that have been done over the past approximately 10 years. And we're on the cusp of getting near the completion of the current capital project, and we will start seeing that building aid number start to increase as we go forward in the coming years, as well as the associated debt service. And we'll get into that more in greater detail in coming budget meetings. The fourth line is reorganization incentive, and that represents the aid associated with the annexation. We are now in the final year, 21-22. That $285,000 payment will represent the final payment in the series of annexation aid payments.
And Scott, if you don't mind, I just want to interject one more. Keep that, file that away, because as we talk about the impact of this current federal stimulus, that reorganization incentive aid will come back up. And, I just want to earmark that and, make a note of that as we proceed through this presentation.
The next couple of lines, one labeled public excess cost, the other private excess cost. They are both related to costs associated with educating special education students. Those aids were not consolidated into the services aid categories and continue to run as current law dictates. The next line is labeled pandemic adjustment, and there's only a number in the current year, the 2021 column, that represents some coronavirus stimulus money that was provided in the last budget cycle or this current fiscal year. The next line is STAR payment, and this is curious with its inclusion by the governor in the executive budget. STAR is not, nor has it ever been considered to be a state aid. It is a payment for a portion of property tax. It's not accounted for as a state aid revenue. It's accounted for as property taxes. So there's a lot of questions and concerns about the inclusion of STAR as an aid in the overall executive budget. The next line is the local district funding adjustment, and it's identical to the STAR payment amount. Why is that? Well, in the explanation provided in the executive budget, that local district funding adjustment was going to be either the lesser of the STAR amount or the COVID-19 supplemental stimulus amount that you see below at $5.6 million. So again, there's a lot of concern about the STAR being included in these state aid runs. One theory is potentially it had to do with satisfying a maintenance of effort requirement in receipt of the federal stimulus dollars. A lot of questions about what if the actual STAR amount is different from the amount included in these runs? Will it be adjusted? What is the ultimate purpose in including the STAR payment in these runs? Is it to eliminate it? Is it to continue on in future years in some other form? A lot of questions, not a lot of answers, and those are to be worked out in the legislative final analysis. So the next I'll stop there and just hit the state subtotal amount, and you will see a negative of $3.5 million. So earlier in the presentation, when Mr. Kaur talked about the overall state reduction to education funding, that relates specifically to North Colony and $3.5 million, only to be supplanted by federal stimulus dollars of $5.6 million. Hence the concern and the funding cliff that could present itself absent continued federal funding or the state's ability to backfill and offset the loss of federal funding in the future. So our bottom line is we're up about $1.5 million per the executive budget's state aid run. As the legislature moves through the analysis of the budget, we'll be keeping a close eye on how some of these very key proposals will be affecting ultimately these dollar amounts that we can confidently include in our own school district budget for 21-22.
So I thank you, Mr. Hoot. That's really important. So I think the big focus here is when we look at 2021 and 21-22, look at the state subtotal in 2021 compared to the state subtotal in 21-22. You can see that, we would not have received $25.2 million from the state. We would have received 21.6. We're down 3.5 million. The federal CARES restoration really represents another loss of 541,000. We received 5.661 million in federal stimulus, but our subtotal for this year is 5.1 that you can see, and that results in our 1.58 increase. So again, had you told people that your federal increase would be, your state increase would be up by $1.5 million, people would have thought that was much better than expected, and I am not minimizing that. But when you look at behind the numbers, and this is the story of the budget, look at behind the numbers, okay? In actuality, the state's commitment to North Colony has diminished by $3.5 million. Left on its own, without federal stimulus, that would be devastating. So let's take a look here at the next slide, which is the 2021-22 preliminary tax levy limit. So, and Mr. Hoot in the slide after this will go in depth and describe that, but the tax levy limit in New York State is tied to the Consumer Price Index. This year it is 1.23%. Our growth in taxable, this is a preliminary estimate. So our assessment growth in taxable values is 1.59%. We have a capital exclusion reduction of 1.38 million. And our pilots equal an increase of $281,052. Pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. It's what local taxing authorities grant to certain businesses to incentivize them to come and build and reside within a certain region. So when you put all the numbers into the tax calculation of the tax levy limit, our tax levy limit is 1.57%. And so if you look at that with the growth of taxable values at 1.59% and the levy limit at 1.57%, you would look at essentially, if that growth value holds at 1.59%, you would look at, roughly the tax impact being flat. Next slide, please. This is and so Mr. Hoot please explain the preliminary tax cap.
Sure. The tax cap is extremely prescriptive. There are no real choices to be made in performing this calculation. And we begin with the current year tax levy. You then adjust that. If you have an adjustment, some districts may have 1.0 and there is no adjustment. In our case, we get to adjust that by 1.59%. So it creates a new baseline. From there, we then do some reconciliation. We add the pilots from the prior year. We then subtract our capital exclusion, and I'll provide some context to what that number is in a minute. We then get to a number which then applies the CPI to it. In a normal year, you might see that up to 2%, the so-called 2% tax cap. But in years when the CPI is lower than 2%, you use the lower number. Again, we get to that modified number and apply adjustments for pilots in the upcoming year and the capital exclusion in the upcoming year. That brings us down to a bottom line of tax levy limit of 1.57%. That's the maximum the district can increase taxes by without seeking a supermajority by exceeding the cap. So let me give a little context to the capital exclusion. That, in our case, relates to debt service, bus purchases, and any BOCES capital project expense that is allocated to North County. You take that total and subtract from it any state aid, any building aid on capital projects, aid on the purchase of school buses, and aid on the BOCES expenditure. That brings you down to a bottom line number that goes into the formula and is called the capital exclusion. So the idea is that when you have capital adjustments each year, districts then modify, and the modification can be, it can increase or it can decrease in each year. But that is the very prescriptive method of working through the formulas in law to come down to a bottom line tax levy limit.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
You had mentioned on an earlier slide about the STAR exemption. You might have said this and I missed it. But does this tax levy number, because I thought I heard you say that that STAR exemption was usually considered part of the property tax. So is this $88 million inclusive of STAR?
It is. So that $88.2 million is our tax levy. And historically, there's a small portion of that, in our case, let's call it $4 million for sake of argument, is associated with STAR. So the tax bills go out, all the exemptions on those tax bills add up to $4 million. An application is made to the state. State ultimately pays that $4 million gap due to the exemption to bring it back up to that 88.2 million tax levy. So the STAR portion has no effect on the property tax cap calculation.
Okay, but is it on the state aid side of the equation now? Or is it wash out because of the way it's being handled on the state aid?
It is one of the questions that is hanging out there in terms of, does the accounting of that change or does it not?
Okay, all right. So I'm confused, but so are you. So okay. Thanks.
Can we go to the next slide, please, Mrs. Dawson? So in terms of trying to sum up here, so North Colony is going to receive $12.1 million in foundation aid. That is frozen to last year's number. So that's the same as the current year, this current school year 2021. The state budget allocates the entire $3.8 billion in federal stimulus aid in 2021. And so without that next year, then the state would either not support education by $3.8 billion, decide to support it in its entirety, which would be probably difficult, or somewhere in between. But the gap is $3.8 billion in terms of the state commitment. Going to the previous question that Sandy just raised, the STAR cut is intended to be recurring, but what happens to it once federal aid is exhausted? Where does that go? Where is the responsibility for that? And we all, and I mean that 700 school districts in the state of New York, have a great concern for the impending fiscal cliff when the federal stimulus aid ceases. And so in this case, the federal budget contains $5.66 million for North Colony. What happens to that $5.66 million when the federal stimulus goes away this year? Will there be additional federal dollars? What is going to happen? So those are huge and substantial questions. So let's go to the next slide, please. So those of you who have been around budget committees for a while may have heard us talking, particularly around 2015, 16, 17, and 18, talk about the gap elimination adjustment, or the GEA. And so the question now is, are we in GEA 2.0? And so if you, we're going a little bit of a history lesson here. So really, federal funds are good, wonderful. They are emergency relief for us now. But in the absence of them, are we ready for a repeat of the gap elimination adjustment? So we go back to the recession of 2008 and its dramatic impact. And so in 2009, 2010, the deficit reduction adjustment, that called the DRA, cut state aid to school district. And that was really mitigated completely by federal funds. It's a familiar story. In North Colony, however, we had a different set of circumstances. And remember, when I asked you to earmark the conversation about the reorganization aid, back effective July 1, 2008, North Colony and the Maplewood Common School District agreed to an annexation. It was something that had to be proposed by both school districts, studied by both school districts, agreed to by both school districts. But once that annexation went through, there was approximately $32 million in aid that was going to come to North Colony as a result of that. It was called reorganization aid. It's part of state law. And so during this time, we had a $3.3 million reduction in state aid. But all throughout this time, and so you look at the period 2008 through 2013, the 5-year period for that was when the reorganization aid was at its apex. And so we had a $3.3 million reduction from the state, but that was offset at that time by the $2.9 million in reorganization aid from the annexation of Maplewood. And so the way that $32 million was expended over those 14 years was that in the first 5 years, Again, it was at its apex. The apex represented by the $2.9 million in reorganization aid. So, if you will, during those very difficult years of 08, 09, 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on, those were the peak years for the reorganization aid. In year 6 through 14, and so next year is year 14, the aid was on a 9-year, $285,000 a year decrease. It was still, a wonderful benefit. And this is the last year of that. So we are down to $285,000. It goes away. Now, essentially, if we take a look at that, that was the impact of 09-10. And in 2010 and 11, the gap elimination adjustment replaced the federal funds, the DRA, and that was, again, that loss was mitigated through the use of federal funds. But again, in North Colony, any kind of reduction, this time $3.6 million, was offset by $2.9 million in reorganization aid. 2011-12 through 2015-16, GEA continued, and the loss to school districts throughout the state was immense, but federal funds were no longer available. And if you take a look at that period, there was a total reduction of $15.5 million to North Colony, and that was offset by $12.7 million in reorganization aid. So we had an extra added special benefit. And by 2016-17, GEA is fully restored. And that means it was restored to year 2009. So we were funding in 16-17 at the level we should have been funding 8 years prior. And so, again, this is, a retelling of the story that we had approximately 10 years ago. Is this what we are facing with GEA 2.0? Can we look at the next slide, please? So when we take a look at building a balanced budget, and this is our obligation in the state of New York, we're not like the federal government or the state government. We can't deficit spend. So with the tax levy, we can raise $1.4 million in tax revenue, and the executive budget increases us by $1.5 million. But a simple rollover of our existing budget with raises and increased healthcare costs figured in equals $4.9 million. And so therefore, we have to figure out a way of filling that deficit of about $2 million, and we could continue to use our fund balance as we did this year, and have additional aid or expenditure reductions. So fortunately, this year, we are looking at the fact that we did not get hit with a possible 20% reduction over the year in our state aid. That was a possibility that was being forecast back in June when we passed our budget. We are looking at the prospect of possibly having a surplus in our budget, but we are also facing the possibility of a projected deficit that we certainly could fill this year, but we are very concerned about, as all school districts are, very concerned about the impending fiscal cliff. So again, to reiterate the previously made point, we have to present a balanced budget as a governmental entity here in the state. So we have to either find expenditure reductions or revenue enhancements in order to close our budget deficit. And so that is where we are. So can we go to the next slide, please? So how do we close present and future gaps? When we have retirements, we try to consolidate or not fill positions. look at how we contain expenditures and seek reductions for economic impact, redesign existing programs to accomplish long-term structural savings, reconsider upcoming and future plans to reimagine previous ideas, challenge previous assumptions, and seek additional revenue opportunities. And then I think we need to reflect back to the critical points made by Deputy Superintendent Skeels in the beginning. And that is, a budget is a plan to meet the needs of our children. And we look at meeting the needs of all our children. We look at meeting their academic needs. We look at meeting their social emotional needs. We look at preparing our staff and supporting our staff to do their jobs, because we know that's where the difference is made in the lives of our children. So we look at our economic challenges within the context of our obligation and our responsibilities to provide for our children, and to provide for our children within the context of a pandemic and the issues that have been raised in their lives as a result of that. So these are our challenges as we go forward. Next slide, please. So to raise your concerns about state dollars and state budgeting, we'll put these contacts up here. We are represented by Assemblyman Phil Steck. You can see his contact information. These presentations will be presented, and they are being recorded, and they will be presented on our website. Senator Neil Breslin is our New York State Senator. We have met with Senator Breslin. We are in constant contact with Assemblyman Steck. But, these are the individuals who you can lobby and make your opinions felt with regard to the state budget and meeting the needs of schools in the state of New York. And next slide, please. So this represents our budget meeting schedule, and I'll come back to this at the end of the meeting. So this was our introductory meeting on March 1st. Next week, we will be looking at the budgets for facilities, custodial, transportation. We'll be looking at our debt service and our interfund transfers. On the 15th of March, we will look at technology and technology equipment, Smart Schools Bond Act. We have March 24th as a date to catch up if we need. If not, then we have an important meeting on the 29th of March. That's where we'd look at staffing, anticipated building enrollment, new programs and initiatives. And then we come back on the 12th of April and we review all the meetings to date. We update our property tax report card and tax cap. And then we approve our different budget schedules. We look at all the schedules for equipment, for staffing. The board approves them individually. On the 21st of April, the board formally adopts the proposed budget. We have a public forum on the budget and a Meet the Candidates night on May 5th. And May 18, 2021 is it's a Tuesday, and it's the statewide date for election and budget vote. And we'll go to the next slide here. I just want to put this up here for a minute. So again, if viewers are watching on the live stream, you can email questions to communications@ncolony.org, and we will try to answer them this evening. And if we can't answer them this evening, we will answer them over time. And I was just updated here that we had 20 viewers in addition to our audience here on the live stream. So Ms. Nardulillo and Mr. Vondell, we have completed our presentation here.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate it. So at this point, as Mr. Corr stated in the beginning, of the presentation, that our format is to open questions up to the Board of Education, and then after those questions are addressed, we'll move on to our budget representatives, and then we can ask if there are questions that have come in through our website, through our email. So, do we have any questions from our Board of Education? Michelle, did you have your hand up? No? I'm sorry.
And we did have a pre-budget meeting with the Board of Education on Thursday night where we went over a lot of these topics as well.
Thank you. So we had some questions then, and you have done a wonderful job. And I look forward to some of the answers to those philosophical questions that have been posed. So I'm looking forward to our future budget meetings to get answers to those questions. So with that, I will ask our budget representatives or anyone else that's on Zoom. I see we have some administrators also with us tonight. So if anyone that is on the Zoom platform, if you have any questions at this point. Okay, do we have any online, Mr. Kaur?
I'll refer to Ms. Julia Kendi here. Julia, do we have any questions that have been posed by our online audience tonight?
No, we don't. And not in our email.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm a little late, a little slow thinking of what the question I had. Can I still ask one?
Of course.
Thank you. This is for Scott about the services aid. And, I know this was proposed last year, and I think you mentioned that it was, last year maybe wasn't even the first year that they tried to propose this change to the services aid kind of a structure. So do you have any sense of whether this it seems more likely that it's going to stick this year, or still just too soon to tell?
It's impossible to predict. It's hard to know, sometimes after you propose something X number of times, maybe you are successful in getting it established. And I think it's fair to say there was some concern that maybe due to the state's budget difficulties that this year might be a time that it might be successful. But it would be unfortunate, to say the least, if it was to be successful. For us, in terms of transportation, would be the lion's share of that services aid number. BOCES being second, and it would be devastating long term if that should be the case, because you can see with foundation aid how it is flat for a couple of years and generally has very minimal increases in the past few years.
Yeah, and so they're going to put it in that kind of a paradigm.
The concern is that it would be in that same vein, would be controlled in that fashion.
So my question, as a follow-up to what you said about transportation aid being the lion's share of this, and just throwing it out there as a question, not necessarily something that you may be prepared to ponder tonight, but we've traditionally done a cash is king approach to buying buses. That is, we buy our buses outright without financing them. And does the possibility of this consolidating into a service aid change the calculus on buying buses outright and put us in a position where bonding buses becomes more advantageous? Maybe not this year, but next year maybe. Just want to throw it out there.
I think that's a legitimate question, and I think it could cause districts to think differently, not only about how they buy school buses, but how they buy other services through BOCES. So really the key there is whether the aid formula associated with the purchase of school buses would remain intact, or would it really kind of fall to the wayside and come under that umbrella? So that's a great question, has significant dollars attached to it, and probably one of the first considerations that would have to be made going forward if the services aid proposal was successful.
Yeah, and switching from cash is king to bonding buses may not be, even if it is something we want to pull the trigger on. It seems to me like we wouldn't want to do it this year, but if next year there's a financial cliff, that might be the year to help us smooth out a financial cliff. And I bet BOCES really hates this.
They do.
Yeah.
Hopefully they will marshal some resources to put some pressure against it. I think it's well wait and see.
And it means significant dollars to North Colony, but think of districts that have extraordinarily high aid ratios, who are in the high needs category and have ratios that are 80, 85, 90%. That would be, even that much more devastating to those districts.
All right, we'll wait and see. Thank you.
That would be something that we could advocate for with our legislators. I know our board of officers and our superintendent and assistant superintendent for business met with them. Was that this year, Joe? Did you have?
We did. Well, yeah, that was pre-pandemic.
Okay.
And so they have met with us as a BOCES group. We have a political government advocacy group with that group, and Assemblyman Steck has not met with us yet, although I have had a conversation with him, but Senator Breslin has met, and it's usually with Manans and with South County and North County together.
Well, if that happens, you'll let us know. I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about this, Dr. Pillai. When we contact the assemblyman and senator, I really love to contact to really tell them, how do we articulate that question? And it's kind of a new thing. It's really, instead of saying, hey, increase the budget, so, or give the, more aid. So is there any ideas or kind of things you can give?
You know what might be, you know what might be very helpful with that, and that's an excellent question. Let me, I will look at, we have constructed various advocacy letters throughout the state. So why don't I look into that, and I can forward those. I could post it on our website, and I certainly could forward it to the Board of Education, forwarded it to our budget committee, and individuals could choose to use that as basically as a template of ideas that they could forward to Senator Breslin and to Assemblyman Steck.
Yeah, definitely. We can contact other parents. Yeah, we can explain the situation. Yeah, it's very, very important this year, right? Especially we are getting this federal thing, then we don't want to. It's going to be disaster next year, right? When we don't have the federal, it's going to be a big disaster.
That's true. Yeah. And there is another stimulus package. How that shapes out is still to be determined, because it's still being legislated. But and we don't know how that money will be utilized by the state of New York. So,
yep. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments at this point? Well, Mr. Core, you got in under 11.
Thank you, Mr. Nardwell. Appreciate it.
And we want to thank all of our budget representatives from the community. We want to thank our Catherine. Catherine, it's really important for us to have a student representative on the budget committee. So I'm glad you took time from, I'm sure, all that homework you had tonight to be here with us. We really appreciate that. I would like to also thank, of course, Mr. Core, Mr. Hoot, and Ms. Skills for all of their efforts when it comes to this budget presentation. And the budget presentation was excellent. It was clear, focused, and very informative. So we appreciate that. And thank you, everyone. I'll take a motion to close out the budget meeting and adjourn. I'll take a motion to close out and adjourn. Mrs. Nardillo, and I'll take a second, Mr. Vondell, and all in favor. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon.
Next Monday.
Next
Thank you,
Monday.
everyone. Have a good evening.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.